Big screening with all of our friends there, but it was a big deal. I hadn't been to one of my own openings in a long
Richard Gere was once the ultimate Hollywood heartthrob, the man every director wanted and the actor every fan adored. From American Gigolo to Pretty Woman, he lived a life of glamour, red carpets, and applause. But today, at 76, things look very different. His reality is no longer defined by flashing cameras and blockbuster scripts. It's marked by quiet struggles, fragile health, and the kind of heartbreak that fame could never protect him from. This is the untold story of how Richard Gere really lives now, and why fans around the world are devastated by what's happening behind closed doors. Richard Gere's journey to becoming a Hollywood icon didn't happen overnight. Born in Philadelphia in 1949, he grew up in a modest, working-class family where life revolved around discipline, hard work, and faith. As a young man, Gere didn't dream of acting. He was more focused on music and even earned a scholarship for his trumpet skills. But fate had other plans, and it wasn't long before his magnetic looks and natural charm drew him into the world of theater. By the mid-1970s, Gere had already carved out a reputation on Broadway, but it was his transition to Hollywood films that cemented his stardom. His breakout role came with American Gigolo, 1980, where his portrayal of a suave escort made him both a sex symbol and a serious actor. The film was more than just a career milestone. It transformed Gere into a cultural icon. His style, his piercing gaze, and his effortless charisma defined masculinity for an entire generation. Overnight, Richard Gere became the face of 1980s Hollywood glamour. But it wasn't just American Gigolo that launched his career into the stratosphere. The 1990 romantic comedy Pretty Woman, opposite Julia Roberts, turned him into a household name worldwide. The film grossed over $460 million globally and remains one of the most beloved romantic movies of all time. For Gere, it was validation that he wasn't just a fleeting star, he was Hollywood royalty. Magazine covers, fan clubs, and paparazzi trailed his every move. He was the man who seemingly had it all: looks, fame, and wealth. Yet, as often happens in Hollywood, the same spotlight that builds careers also casts long, unforgiving shadows. By the late 1990s, Gere began experiencing the downside of fame. Despite starring in hits like Chicago, 2002, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture, he found himself increasingly pushed aside by a younger generation of actors. Ageism in Hollywood is a well-documented phenomenon, and Gere was not immune. Once the go-to leading man for romantic roles, he suddenly found himself overlooked for parts he had once dominated. Complicating matters further was his outspoken political activism. Gere became one of the most prominent voices in Hollywood advocating for human rights in Tibet, publicly criticizing the Chinese government. While this earned him respect from activists around the globe, it came at a steep professional cost. Major studios, heavily reliant on the Chinese market for box office revenue, began distancing themselves from him. Roles that might have gone to Gere a decade earlier now landed in the laps of younger, less politically controversial actors. The decline in offers wasn't just a professional blow, it was deeply personal. For someone who had lived decades in the public eye, the sudden quietness of his career felt like exile. In interviews, Gere hinted at his frustration, admitting that being politically vocal had made him uncastable in mainstream Hollywood. To many fans, it seemed unthinkable that one of the most bankable stars of the 80s and 90s could be all but sidelined. But behind the red carpets and glowing magazine spreads, Richard Gere's career was fading into the background. By his 60s, Gere transitioned into more independent films, many of which showcased his depth as an actor but lacked the worldwide reach of his earlier blockbusters. While these roles kept his artistic spirit alive, they also highlighted how far he had fallen from the Hollywood A-list. The man who once lit up the box office now found himself in quiet productions seen by only select audiences. Today, at 76, Richard Gere is far removed from the man who strutted through American Gigolo or swept Julia Roberts off her feet in Pretty Woman. His silence from Hollywood is deafening, and his retreat from the spotlight speaks volumes about the cost of staying true to one's beliefs. This chapter of his life is not about premieres and fame. It's about the quiet unraveling of a man who once ruled Hollywood, now living in the shadows of his own legacy. For much of his career, Richard Gere was the embodiment of vitality and grace. His lean frame, silver hair, and youthful energy made him appear almost ageless, even as the years rolled on. Fans often remarked that Gere seemed immune to the normal wear and tear of life, as though the camera loved him too much to let time leave its marks. But behind the scenes, the truth was far more sobering. By his 70s, Gere's health began to falter, and the realities of aging started catching up with the once untouchable star. Reports surfaced in recent years that Gere had quietly battled recurring health issues, including bouts of pneumonia and persistent respiratory problems. In early 2023, fans were alarmed to learn that Gere had been hospitalized during a family vacation in Mexico. According to those close to him, what began as a simple cough quickly escalated into a serious lung infection, leaving the actor bedridden for days. Although he recovered enough to return home, the incident was a wake-up call. Even Hollywood legends aren't invincible. This was not the first time Gere's health raised concerns. Sources close to him hinted that stress, overwork, and years of constant travel had weakened his immune system. For decades, Gere lived on film sets, jetting from one country to another, often pushing his body to its limits. While fans saw the glamour of premieres and magazine photo shoots, the exhaustion and toll of that lifestyle were invisible. Aging only made it harder for Gere to bounce back, and the man once admired for his energy was forced to slow down. Adding to the concern was Gere's own reluctance to publicize his struggles. Unlike many celebrities who share health battles with fans, Gere preferred privacy. His silence led to endless speculation. Rumors of more serious illnesses spread online, some exaggerated and others completely unfounded. Yet those who knew him best described a man facing the same inevitable decline as anyone else in their 70s. Just with the added weight of public scrutiny, the health scares also shifted how Gere lived his daily life. Once known for his disciplined fitness routines and healthy diet, rooted in Buddhism and mindfulness, Gere found himself forced to adapt. Exercise became lighter, his stamina shortened, and long hours on set were no longer an option. He spent more time resting, taking medical advice seriously, and embracing a slower lifestyle far removed from his Hollywood prime. Despite these challenges, Gere displayed remarkable resilience. His wife, Alejandra Silva, nearly 34 years his junior, became a steady source of strength. Friends say that her presence gave him renewed motivation to take better care of himself. Together, they focused on family life, with Gere becoming a father again in his 70s. The joy of raising young children at such an advanced age brought him happiness. But it also added urgency. He wanted to remain strong enough to watch them grow. Still, the contrast between the Richard Gere the world remembers and the man he is today can be heartbreaking. Once the picture of effortless charm and energy, he now moves with the visible caution of someone aware of life's fragility. Paparazzi photos of Gere in recent years often spark concern among fans, showing a thinner, more fragile figure. Each public appearance feels like a reminder of the passing of time and how even icons are not immune to the realities of aging. Yet, Gere's health struggles haven't dimmed his spirit entirely. In rare interviews, he speaks of gratitude for his family, for his career, and for the quiet life he now enjoys. His voice carries the weight of someone who has faced both the heights of fame and the vulnerabilities of age. For fans, it is bittersweet. Their beloved star is still here, but he is no longer the untouchable figure he once was. Instead, he is human, fragile, and facing the same challenges millions of others endure in their later years. Richard Gere, at 76, is no longer defined by red carpets and flashing cameras, but by the delicate balance between resilience and vulnerability. And though he continues to battle health challenges, his determination to carry on, quietly, privately, and gracefully remains as inspiring as ever. For many, Richard Gere's life looks like a fairy tale: global fame, critical acclaim, wealth, and adoration from millions of fans. But those closest to him know that behind the curtain of Hollywood glamour lies a quieter, more difficult truth. Fame can be an isolating prison, and as Gere has grown older, that loneliness has only deepened. Throughout his career, Gere's charm and leading man status often made it seem as if he was the most connected man in the world. Yet, when the camera stopped rolling and the lights faded, he often found himself retreating into solitude. Unlike many actors of his generation, Gere was never fully consumed by Hollywood's social scene. He kept a distance, preferring meditation retreats to wild parties and deep conversations to industry gossip. At first, this set him apart as someone grounded, but as the years passed, it also contributed to a certain detachment from his peers. This sense of isolation only intensified after his career slowed. In the 1980s and 90s, Gere was everywhere, on magazine covers, red carpets, and movie posters. But by the mid-2000s, roles began to dwindle. Hollywood, always chasing the next young star, seemed to move on, leaving Gere behind. For a man who had once defined an era of romance and sophistication, the abrupt shift was jarring. Fans still adored him, but industry calls grew fewer, and invitations became less frequent. In many ways, Gere transitioned from a global star to a figure living quietly in the shadows of his past glory. Adding to this was Gere's outspoken nature. Unlike some actors who kept their personal beliefs hidden, Gere often spoke publicly about politics, human rights, and social justice. His activism for Tibet and criticism of China famously resulted in him being unofficially blacklisted in certain Hollywood circles. Major studios, wary of offending international markets, began avoiding his name. While Gere stood firm in his convictions, the professional consequences left him more isolated than ever. As he entered his 70s, this isolation took on new dimensions. Many of the friends and colleagues who once shared his journey either retired, drifted away, or passed on. The bustling social circles of his younger days gave way to smaller, more private gatherings. Paparazzi photos often show Gere walking alone, lost in thought, or quietly attending events without the entourage once associated with stars of his caliber. For fans, these images painted a portrait of a man who had traded the noise of fame for the stillness of solitude, but at a cost. His family life has been both a blessing and a complicated source of reflection. Gere's marriage to Alejandra Silva brought joy and stability, but with a young wife and small children, the age gap often left him straddling two worlds. On one hand, he is a doting father, eager to play, teach, and nurture. On the other, he is acutely aware of his own mortality, often feeling the weight of being decades older than most fathers in the schoolyard. This awareness has deepened his sense of isolation as he quietly wonders how much of his children's lives he will live to see. Loneliness also emerges in his relationship with fans. For decades, Gere was adored, idolized, and celebrated. But in his later years, he rarely engages with the spotlight. He avoids social media, keeps interviews minimal, and turns down public appearances unless absolutely necessary. While this privacy protects him, it also creates distance. Fans who once felt deeply connected to him through his films now feel as if they're watching from afar, unable to truly reach the man who once lit up their screens. And yet, in this solitude, Gere has found a strange sense of peace. Buddhism has long taught him that attachment leads to suffering, and perhaps this quiet isolation is his way of practicing what he's preached. He meditates, spends time in nature, and immerses himself in humanitarian work when he can. To some, this looks like loneliness. To Gere, it may be a form of liberation. Still, for those who grew up idolizing him, seeing Richard Gere so removed from the world feels heartbreaking. The man who once defined romance, charm, and human connection now lives in a bubble of privacy, his life defined less by the glamour of Hollywood and more by the silence that surrounds him. The loneliness of fame, once easy to ignore in the rush of stardom, has now become one of the most defining aspects of his twilight years. At 76, Richard Gere finds himself in a place few Hollywood icons ever truly reach. The quiet final act of a life lived under the brightest lights, now dimmed to a softer glow. For many, this stage of life would be consumed with nostalgia, regret, or denial. But Gere approaches it with a mix of grace and bittersweet reflection, though the realities he faces are far from easy. In the prime of his career, Gere was more than just a movie star. He was a cultural force. Films like Pretty Woman, An Officer and a Gentleman, and Chicago cemented him as both a romantic lead and a serious actor. His characters embodied charm, resilience, and a kind of effortless masculinity that defined an entire generation of cinema. Yet, as Gere himself often admitted, Hollywood was never the core of his identity. Acting was a career, yes, but his heart belonged to deeper pursuits: activism, spirituality, and personal growth. Now, with his career largely behind him, Gere spends much of his time reflecting on that balance. In private conversations, he has reportedly acknowledged the odd paradox of fame. It gave him everything the world could offer, and yet it left him yearning for something more lasting, something real. That search has become more pressing in recent years, as his health wavers and his energy fades. Time, once an endless gift, now feels like a fragile resource. One of Gere's most significant reflections lies in his family. Becoming a father again in his 70s has reshaped his priorities. His children, both grown and young, are the anchors of his present life. He often speaks of them as his greatest joy, his truest purpose, and the reason he pushes through his health struggles. But privately, those close to him say he worries constantly about not being there for them in the years to come. Every birthday, every milestone is a reminder that his time is limited. The thought of leaving his wife Alejandra to raise their children without him weighs heavily, and while Gere rarely speaks about it openly, his actions show his awareness. He spends as much time as possible with them, carving out memories that might one day serve as echoes of his love. Professionally, Gere's legacy is complicated but undeniable. While Hollywood largely turned its back on him after his political outspokenness, his body of work remains cherished. Fans still revisit his films, reminding the world of a time when Richard Gere was the epitome of romantic stardom. Yet he himself seems disinterested in legacy in the traditional sense. He has little interest in being remembered as a star. Instead, he hopes his activism, his humanitarian work, and his efforts to raise awareness about Tibet and human rights will outshine the glitz of Hollywood. In his view, that is the true measure of a meaningful life. But even as Gere tries to find solace in spirituality and purpose, there is a haunting sadness to his later years. Once adored by millions, he now spends much of his life shielded from the public eye. His appearances are rare, his interviews brief, and his interactions with fans minimal. Some see this as dignity in aging, but others can't help but see heartbreak in the isolation. It is the cruel irony of fame. The world once couldn't get enough of him, and now he slips quietly through life, often unnoticed. What makes Gere's story so moving is that it mirrors the very themes he portrayed on screen: love, loss, resilience, and the fragility of time. He was once the knight in shining armor, the irresistible charmer, the hero who always got the girl. Today, he is simply a man facing the same fears and frailties as anyone else. The glamour has faded, but the humanity remains, raw and visible. For his fans, the thought of Richard Gere growing old and fragile is almost unbearable. He was supposed to be eternal, the man whose smile could light up the darkest room. Yet here he is, a reminder that even legends are human. Even stars fade, and even icons carry heartbreak in their final chapters. And so, as Richard Gere quietly moves through his 76th year, the world watches with equal parts love and sorrow. His legacy is secure, his impact undeniable. But his reality now is not about fame, not about Hollywood, not even about legacy. It's about facing the twilight of life with as much grace as he can muster. And for those who adored him for decades, that truth is as heartbreaking as it is profoundly human.